heroin. How and when did the sheriff's office recognize that we have a problem with heroin in our community?
Most of it kind of came in about 2007, 2008, 2009. Our drug task force had been aware of it and was starting to see an increase of its use and sales in the community. The biggest indicator, however, was the overdoses and the fatalities associated with heroin use.
And that started
2008 and 2009 were the two big years when we really took note of what was occurring.
And heroin, why here? Why now? Why in Anoka County?
Well, you can look at Minnesota first, and that would be a rather prosperous economic environment. We have been, we haven't suffered from the other areas of the recession other parts of the country have. So there's been a stable economy here in Minnesota, which lends to that. Also, when you take and consider either the I-35 corridor coming out of Texas or the I-94 corridor coming out of Chicago, it provides a nice access or pipeline to illicit drugs within the Minneapolis area here. Anoka County specifically, again, I think you've got a pretty stable workforce, a pretty stable economy, and a generally close proximity to Minneapolis and St. Paul, which are the large cities, the large markets. And when you combine the two of those and those couple of factors, it certainly lends itself to heroin use and abuse.
With the changes in the law that makes pseudoephedrine, you have to get it behind the counter, and a corresponding decline in the meth production, are people replacing heroin with the meth?
It's difficult to say because until we break it down on a user by user, person by person basis, it's difficult to draw that out. We're seeing people that were once using methamphetamine now using heroin. The way the body reacts to it is entirely different, but I think you still have to look at that own individual's propensity for addiction and things like that. But the heroin thing is, to me, from what we're finding, much more non-discriminatory. You're seeing it really cut across different ages and aspects of society, whether that's, you're from poverty to middle class to upper middle class. We're seeing a lot more usage of heroin than we did with methamphetamine.
You say it reacts differently in the body. How so?
Well, methamphetamine is a stimulant. So people that are under the influence of methamphetamine oftentimes will find themselves awake for 24 to 36 to 48 to 72 hours, depending how much they use and how frequently they want to use. Also, many times we see much more violent behavior associated with methamphetamine, to include what has been called a methamphetamine-induced psychosis. With heroin, it is a depressant. It depresses the central nervous system, and that's why oftentimes it appears that a person under the influence of heroin is simply asleep or dozing off.
So what specifically is making heroin the drug of choice here? Is it cost? Is it ease of getting the drug?
I think that it is just the addiction. The addiction and detoxification of heroin is what's creating the addicts and the demand for it. I think a lot of times people get into heroin by using opiate-based pain relievers, things like OxyContin, Valium, Percocet, and they quickly find themselves addicted to that. And obtaining those pharmaceuticals through illegitimate means, whether that's doctor shopping or robbing from pharmacies or trying to buy it on the black market, is very expensive and very labor intensive. The cheaper and more easily obtainable substitute is heroin. And it seems that it's no longer about the high or the recreational component of heroin, but rather the withdrawal and the detoxification from it that's causing and compelling people to use and use and use again.
Do you think the prescription opiates are overprescribed?
I think they were. I think that's what got us here. If you look at some of the numbers of how overprescribed they were from those years of 2005 up to 2010 and 11 and 12, they obviously were. And the FDA, the DEA have worked together to significantly reduce the overprescription of those opiate-based pain relievers. However, we have created a segment of society that is now addicted to that, and they're forced to no longer try to get those pills, but they're using heroin instead.
Is there a typical heroin user in our community? Is it teens? Is it young adults?
We're seeing young adults, and that's the frightening part, because that, when we get called out on these overdoses and fatalities, to see someone as young as 15 years old dying of an overdose is tragic. And I think there's just a lack of education about how dangerous, one, the opiate-based pain relievers are, and two, switching to heroin or experimenting with heroin, as compared to drugs like marijuana and other things like that don't nearly have the addictive tendencies that heroin does. Beyond that, it's hitting everyone, different age groups, different socioeconomic classes, like no other drug in recent memory.
What on earth is getting people to try this in the first place? I mean, is there a gateway drug, one specific gateway drug?
Just based on my experience, oftentimes we see the younger people, they're using marijuana frequently, almost habitually. They're drinking alcohol, so they're out there sort of trying different drugs, again, for recreational purposes. And so then unfortunately, sometimes they're led down that road, maybe even under an altered state of mind, where they try heroin, and very quickly addiction sets in. The other one is just the prescription-based pain relievers, or the opiate-based pain relievers, in which these young people are taking the pills out of their own medicine cabinets or those of friends and start using it. Sometimes they've been legitimately prescribed OxyContin or Valium, and addiction sets in. It's a slippery slope for those young people, because you see on there that's been prescribed by a doctor. It's been prescribed for legitimate means and purposes, with a pharmacological purpose and intent as a pain reliever, and simply unaware of the addictive tendencies of those opiate-based pain relievers.
We heard a lot about heroin in the 70s, a lot of rock stars and whatever overdose. What's different about the heroin today than in the 70s? Is it more pure?
Well, speaking to Minnesota, it's exclusively, it's much purer in Minnesota than anywhere else in the country.
And why is that?
The only thing we can come back with again is the ease of access, using the United States interstate system to get it into Minnesota. I think those people selling it, the major providers of it, are also aware of Minnesota's relatively stable environment, knowing that there's a market here for it, unfortunately. And as far as the purity and lower price, maybe the best analogy is it's the free samples at the grocery store. Let's get it into the market, let's give it purer and cheaper, and then we've got them hooked. It's no different than the test drive in the nice car. Let's give it to someone and see what happens.
What does it cost for?
We're seeing it for the most part about $100 a gram on the street.
And a gram?
For a new user, a beginner user, a person that hasn't been a long time addict, a tenth of a gram would be a dosage unit.
So for $10?
$10 you can get your heroin high, which is much cheaper than trying to buy the diverted pharmaceuticals, which are going for about $1,000 a gram. Heroin's much cheaper. You'll see heavy heroin users and addicts oftentimes using 2 and 3 grams a day. And now you're talking about a $300 a day habit, which just is not sustainable.
Well, let's talk about what happens when people find themselves in that position. How much do you attribute, a rise in crime?
Most of our crimes are theft related. With that, it's stealing copper from homes, it's stealing from friends and family. Again, prostitution comes into play, which brings in human trafficking to support the addiction, to support the trade. And oftentimes these people, they do hit skid row very quickly in that they run out of friends and family and a support network to continue their habit and their usage, and they quickly find themselves on the streets or forced to now begin selling the drug, which they're also using just to support their habit.
How does one get heroin? What are you forced to do?
Right now, unfortunately, it's very easy. You can go to any street corner in our market areas of St. Paul or Minneapolis and ask around, and there's going to be a network of people who will steer you in the right direction. Through these forums and through some of the information that became available recently, and frighteningly, there's a lot of kids in high school that could get access to heroin very quickly also.
Have we been able to quantify, I mean, as far as the number of users, or how do you quantify? Is it by the number of deaths? Is that the only way to?
Well, as far as law enforcement, we're marking our arrests. We monitor our amounts seized. Within my division here, the Criminal Investigation Division, we're counting deaths and overdoses, which is not necessarily a good indicator of where usage is at, whether it's rising or lowering or anything like that. And other than that, we depend on a lot of our statistics through Carol Falkowski's group or through Minnesota Adult and Teen Challenge and some of the research they put together and the data they gather. Hazelden Foundation's always been a good resource for at least people entering into treatment programs for opiate-based or heroin addiction.
What do I do if I suspect my child or someone that I know might be using heroin? What are the warning signs?
Again, oftentimes it's a very quick change in friends and peer groups. Following up on them, looking through their phone, sort of invading their privacy, looking through their bedroom and seeing what's there. Because you don't have to inject heroin to become a heroin addict. You know, to look for needle marks, that would be an indicator that something's wrong, but there's a lot of heroin addicts that have never injected heroin. They smoke it, they snort it. So you're going to see, obviously, the money drying up very fast. You're going to see them disengaged from their normal peer groups or other family activities. If they're in their bedroom sleeping all day, it shouldn't be like that. Even a teenager, young person likes their sleep, but 20 hours a day isn't normal.
Are there physical?
You'll often see just, I guess you'll see that person's, that body transformation, that they're not getting the nourishment they need. And so oftentimes they begin to look emaciated, withdrawn, tired, and that could be a sign of something else. It's sort of a culmination of events and circumstances that parents and other people need to look for. And you got to look at everything. Are their grades slipping? Are there concerns about them sleeping in class? Are they hoarding money? Are you missing money? Is there property missing from your home? All these are indicators that when you add them together, certainly don't lead you down a good path as far as what your child's doing.
How is heroin addiction treated? I've heard that the withdrawal is a particularly miserable experience.
It's treated the way many other drugs have been treated, as far as whether it's a 12-step program or inpatient program. Heroin, they always recommend an inpatient program, simply because to have access and freedom in those hours in the evenings provide too much temptation for a heroin addict. They're seeing the psychological craving for heroin lasts from months to years, which is unlike what they've seen in the past with alcohol and marijuana and even methamphetamine.
What is law enforcement doing specifically to fight this?
We are working, and we started an initiative with the DEA that continues to evolve even today, as far as targeting some of the major sources of supply of heroin in the Minneapolis and St. Paul area to try to cut off that flow of heroin into our community. And as well as on a street level, those people arrested with small amounts of heroin, talking to them, finding out who their dealers are, and trying to get those people arrested and charged so they can get the services they need to remain clean and sober. The other part is what we're doing here today as far as the educational component, along with the heroin forums we've had in the community. Until we really reduce the demand for the drug, the supply is going to be there. And law enforcement by nature is reactionary. We go where there's a problem. And we realize, especially with heroin and other drug usage, until you try to educate the public and those young people most vulnerable to drug use and try to lower that demand, it's going to be a difficult road.
What can all of us, can we as members of the community do to fight the spread of heroin use?
First and foremost is just educating your friends and family about the dangers of it. And again, you can't have a conversation about heroin without first having a conversation about those opiate-based pain relievers. Oftentimes in my conversations with a lot of the heroin addicts on their first usage, it was from their own medicine cabinet in their own home. And getting those drugs out of the home, dropping them off at your nearest law enforcement facility at the drug take-back program so that those drugs can be destroyed in a safe manner so that they're not staying in persons' homes with people that may make a poor decision one time and use those.
Talk a little bit more about the drug take-back program. That's anonymous. I mean, there's
Yep, we have drug take-back boxes. They like large mailboxes here at the Anoka County Sheriff's Office. There's one in St. Francis. There's one at other law enforcement agencies within Anoka County. And you can simply come in, open it up, and drop it in there with no questions asked. And that way, it's in safe hands, and then we have a process here at the Anoka County Sheriff's Office for getting rid of all of those prescriptions.
I was at the Lord of Life presentation.
Okay.
You were obviously at all three of them.
Yep.
I got a lot out of that one. What did you take away from being at all three? Did you learn anything?
Again, more, I guess, coming face to face with the friends and family of heroin addicts sort of just compels me to work harder and see the need for it and see how this drug has destroyed their families and see the different stages that these parents most commonly are in dealing with their children's addiction. From not willing to embrace tough love to wanting to get their child's dealer and friends taken off the streets, to working and partnering with their child, to almost, and at the other side, creating a codependency with their child where they give their child money and continue to let them use and stay in their own home for fear of having them out on the street. The manipulation that addiction can cause is always frightening. And talking to reasonably sound people who are struggling with their loved one's addiction and how they've been manipulated in their own lives to do things that would seem otherwise crazy is frightening to me. And to hear those stories, it scares me as a parent and a member of the community.
Why are our numbers so high compared to other metro counties?
Without having any scientific data to support it, the numbers are there's 52 Anoka County residents that have died as compared to 49 Hennepin County residents that have died in the last 5 years from heroin overdose. Again, I think you have to look at a fairly stable economy here in our county. You have a lot of people that move out to the suburbs for the sole purpose of removing themselves from high crime and drugs. And so with that, there might be some degree of naivete that, we're immune from that because we're in the nice suburbs. Those people that grew up in the poorer and more drug-riddled areas of Minneapolis and St. Paul are very, very aware of the drug problem in their community. Here, I think we get caught off guard until it's too late. And that's something I can come up that may speak for some of it.
And is it because of the purity that somebody could just try it once and beat it?
A lot of our overdose deaths have been from people who have been clean for a number of months or years, and whereas they used to use a half a gram or a third of a gram or maybe a full gram, their body's no longer used to it and no longer has the tolerance built up for that drug, and to go back to using what they were once using The body's not going to accept that. Second is the purity levels are always different. And when you talk about purity levels ranging from 9% to 93%, that is such a vast difference that even a heavily addicted chronic heroin user can die from one single overdose based on the purity levels.
Is it, to what do you attribute the difference in the purity? Are they adding stuff to it?
Oftentimes they're adding stuff to it. You know, if you buy 2 grams of heroin and sell 2 grams of heroin, you haven't made any money. If you cut it, and they use any number of different cutting agents, from aspirin to vitamin powder, and that 2 grams becomes 3 grams, now you've got a profit margin.
Less pure.
Less pure. And that's always the case with other drugs like methamphetamine and cocaine. As you cut it, you know, your 1 ounce becomes 1.5 ounces, and so on and so forth.
And there's no way of knowing by looking at it.
No, no, and that's again where people are making that mistake. It looks like heroin, and they use it, and then they're overdosed.
The most, I think I've read the most effective high, whatever, is from injecting, right? Is that correct?
Right.
Also-
But you can, you know, it's still going to get in the bloodstream. You inhale it, it's in the lungs just like that. Snorting it obviously is the slowest way to go because you have so much of it caught in the mucous membranes in the nose and throat. But inhaling, injecting is always the quickest high.
What are the long-term lasting physical effects of heroin addiction?
That I don't know. How the body recovers from addiction and from the abuse that addiction takes. Obviously, you would have to assume liver, kidney problems, things like that. The greater danger, however, is that person relapsing back into use again. And that's kind of across the board, whether you can talk about alcohol or tobacco or meth or heroin too, is that person's likelihood of relapsing, which presents the greatest danger.
Of different drugs, is heroin tougher to kick than others?
That's what's been said. Again, I'm not an addiction medicine specialist, but I think that's part of what's lending to the problem here is, again, that addiction that's based mostly on withdrawal and detoxification is stronger than what you see with other drugs.